One of my favorite cartoon shows that I really enjoyed during my childhood days was DuckTales. Besides the stories and animation, the adventurous characters always had me glued till the end. Be it Scrooge's explorations to find hidden treasures or the daring triplets Huey, Dewey and Louie, they all made the show interesting. However, their sense of adventure or daring did not compare to Launchpad, Uncle Scrooge's personal pilot who would always crash land every time he flies a plane. Surprisingly, Scrooge never fired Launchpad. In fact, Launchpad would ritualistically show up for every adventure only to crash land another plane or helicopter. What if I say that we are not much different from Uncle Scrooge and our minds from Launchpad? Similar to Launchpad's helpless crash landings, our mind also goes into many involuntary actions, sort of like an unregulated autopilot, and negatively affect our lives. Be it falling for such price tags or supporting our hypocritical political leaders. Our mind cannot change its nature, just like Launchpad who had to crash every time he flied a plane. These autopilots of the mind are collectively called cognitive biases. This video will highlight 9 important cognitive biases that our mind slips into for simplifying scenarios while leaving the big picture behind. So without further ado, let's begin.
God, you're addicted to action. It doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't matter what I do. Just as long as I'm doing something, you're happy to be along for the ride.
Exactly. We tend to go optimistic, seeing things in motion or plans executed fast. While action is a great virtue to have and often denotes performers, being addicted to demonstrations of action and perceiving it as some form of progress is not a good habit. However, we are all guilty of it. It is one of the most common autopilots that the mind fails to dodge. In fact, I personally attribute this tendency to people who run around with files in the office to project a perception of themselves being hardworking and, most importantly, action-oriented. In this case though, we can learn and train our minds intellectually that not all people running around with files are hardworking, but in many cases where action bias is connected to reflexes, the mind cannot help but fall for the bias repeatedly. This problem is common with goalkeepers. Standing in the middle, they often tend to move towards their right or left to save a goal. However, studies suggest that more shots come towards the center instead. Despite that, goalkeepers prefer to jump instead of staying stationary because moving or taking action gives them a sense of productivity and action. Statistically, however, they may end up saving more if they stay around the center instead of moving to their left or right. Additionally, action bias also perpetuates the cycle of creating underconfident children. Kids that are action-oriented or participative are often unfairly favored by the teachers against children who mostly stay silent in the classroom. To learn more, watch our full video on action bias. Link is in the description. Anchoring bias is a peculiar phenomenon and one of the most common autopilot or mind anchors exploited by businesses. In this cognitive bias, we fix ourselves to the first piece of information or an initial value called the anchor, and then derive a perception of gain or loss by comparing it to the new value. Be it items on sale or product demos, price anchors are everywhere. For example, when Steve Jobs first announced the iPad to the world, he did not emphasize the smooth scrolling or its impeccable browsing capabilities. People already saw that with the iPhone. Hence, our focus was tunneled to the $499 price tag instead. What Jobs did was to fix our brains onto the first piece of information and then create a comparison by offering a new value. We were forced to look back at the $999 price tag and compare it with the new price, and all of a sudden the iPad started to look cheap. Anchoring bias is often used to create a perception of great deal or trigger the fear of missing out. It may appear that only external forces can create anchoring bias, but that is not true. We ourselves possess the ability to create anchors internally. Our mind does that to simplify and make sense of the information. Anchoring bias is really interesting, for it manifests through optical illusion and multiple other ways. Hence, It does not matter if we understand this autopilot of the mind intellectually, because avoiding slipping into it will remain challenging. In fact, anchoring bias does not even spare judges from getting influenced for the same reason. To learn more about anchoring bias, watch the full video. Link is in the description. Anchoring bias inherent to price anchors generate a sense of urgency within our minds. But despite the lure, it is not easy to make people pay. This is why, in the present day and age, price anchors have found a companion: cashless payments. This makes way for the third cognitive bias in our list, the pain of payment. Pain of payment is a bunch of negative emotions we feel when we are parting ways from a large sum of money. It is a collective emotion that restricts us from buying expensive things and keeps our urges limited to window shopping alone. But do you know that the pain of payment can vary depending on how you decide to pay for your items? People feel the pain of payment significantly when paying with cash. However, digital payments do not make these feelings overwhelmingly painful. Yes, it seems paying digitally, be it with credit cards or wallet apps, can mitigate this pain by a large degree. No wonder the world is moving towards more cashless transaction with each passing year. As for consequences, this bias can also be very detrimental because of its ability to trigger our compulsive spending habits. Today, cashless transactions are hard to escape, for they have become integral to our modern-day economies. If you want to know how the entire ecosystem of cashless transaction functions, watch our full video. Link is in the description. Speaking of spending habits, it is common to feel guilty, but it is also common to find people who justify overspending beyond their financial capacity. It isn't like they do not understand the idea intellectually that compulsive spending can put their lives in jeopardy. But despite that, their habits remain unchanged. Same is the case with people addicted to certain foods or people who support corrupt politicians despite the contradictory nature of their favorite leader. Any counter-argument evokes a sense of discomfort in their minds. The argument is either rejected or met with opposition. In fact, these people may even go and find answers from the internet only to justify their choices or habits despite knowing very well that they are wrong. This psychological state of discomfort that occurs when a person's beliefs, attitudes, or values are contradictory or inconsistent with their actions is called cognitive dissonance. Simply put, it is the inner conflict felt by a person holding two contradictory beliefs at the same time. When confronted with facts, people facing cognitive dissonance try to rationalize their opinion or point of view as being logical or ethical in multiple ways. For example, someone addicted to smoking might downplay its risk that they just smoke a couple of sticks a day and that the body can handle that much of intoxicants. However, they know very well that even one cigarette can possibly induce significant and irreversible harm to their lungs in the long run. The question is, why do they deny the obvious and justify things that we collectively know are wrong? It all boils down to three main reasons: addictive behaviors, burden to choose one option from multiple options, and social pressure. Whatever be the reason, I personally see cognitive dissonance as an act of lying to oneself that is triggered by one of the three reasons. However, what dwells at the bottom, what really drives this bias, is ultimately rooted in ego and fear. And this ego and fear is often a result of long-term conditioning acquired throughout our lives. It is often challenging for an expert to help someone with cognitive dissonance because cognitive dissonance is really the tip of the iceberg. This is why this autopilot of the mind needs some kind of rude awakening for the individual, and often the process is gradual and may even be spiritual. Watch the complete video from the description to learn more about cognitive dissonance. Meanwhile, we move on to our next cognitive bias, an autopilot that stems from one of the driving factors of cognitive dissonance itself: social pressure. Social pressure is quite a significant force that dictates the outcome of so many group settings. However, social pressure can also lead to herd behavior in people. You see, any activity with a social part is likely to come with some level of restrictions to our self-expression. In order to keep the peace, we often make compromises and try to assimilate into a group as much as possible. Though at times we tend to overcompensate to the point where we start ignoring our analytical judgment as well. This is where we come face to face with a bias called the groupthink bias. Groupthink bias is a form of cognitive bias that tends to put us into a cooperative, gullible but irrational state of mind in order to conform to a group. In 1970, Solomon Asch conducted an experiment to see how people respond to certain group situations. He put together a group of participants who in reality were his confederates. The subject had no idea about this secret arrangement and then asked to choose between 3 lines that resemble the length of a previously shown line. Confederates deliberately chose the wrong option and the main subject followed suit despite the visible difference. This attitude to conform to a group is what leads to this herd behavior. I personally think that we tend towards groupthink and social conformity mainly because our social experiences are largely positive in nature. Cognitively, we tend to go back to our good social memories that motivated us in our lives. However, it can also lead us astray if we are too gullible to social norms and rules. The idea is not to become a rebel. Instead, it is about being self-assured and questioning things without any prejudice or conditioning. Social facilitation is defined as a phenomenon where the presence of others in any activity can boost your performance. The phenomenon was first demonstrated by American psychologist Norman Triplett of Indiana University in 1898. Triplett found that cyclists who trained alongside other cyclists fared better compared to beating their personal best. You can see that competition among cyclists boosted mutual performance. But social facilitation goes beyond competition. We can also trigger this autopilot through appreciation in a social setting. Yes, compliments do make a difference, and social facilitation proves that point vividly. However, this autopilot of the mind comes with a caveat, and that is, the performer should bear experience and must have practiced the skill. Without refined skills and prior experience, the performance suffers. Social facilitation teaches a valuable lesson that we shouldn't be overconfident based on our experience with just one type of task or partial experience. Even if 2 tasks are somewhat related, they may require a different set of skills and planning. If you want to learn more about social facilitation, watch our full video. Link is in the description. The next cognitive bias is an interesting one. We are subjected to this autopilot of the mind multiple times a day. We are talking about recency effect, a cognitive bias where we tend to remember the latest information about any subject while forgetting the information in the beginning. Recency bias forms the essence of multiple things: memorable endings, epilogues, song outros, and much more. Writers and creators often employ recency bias to strategically craft their message. It is no surprise that the conclusion of an essay or story or song outros are often more memorable. Of course, this is a good use of this unregulated autopilot of the mind. However, the negative consequences of recency bias outweighs the positive benefits by a great degree. For example, investing by following recent trends alone may lead to poor investment decision in the stock market. In addition to that, we might weigh more on the recent conflicts we had with our partner while forgetting years of positive interactions. We have all been victims of the recency effect at some point in our lives. However, you may be startled to know that it is not just the concluding details alone that leads to a bias. Similar to retaining the last bits, we tend to retain the first bits of information as well. This tendency is what we call the primacy effect. Primacy effect is opposite of the recency effect, in which we remember items at the beginning of the list. Similar to the recency effect, the primacy effect is also a significant autopilot of the mind that affects our judgment and is tricky to eliminate. Someone judging you from their first impression alone is an example of primacy effect. We know that humans are complex creatures and it takes much time to truly know someone. Hence, it is not justifiable to form an opinion about someone based on their initial appearance or introduction while ignoring their later responses or achievements. This is how the primacy effect influences the outcome of interviews for candidates. Same is the case with dating. The first few moments with amazing catchphrases and love bombing should not overshadow the entire conversation. You can learn more about recency and primacy effect from one of our previous videos. Link is in the description. Alright, it's now time to move to our last autopilot of the mind, the last cognitive bias, empathy gap. Empathy gap is a tricky cognitive bias in the sense that we hardly even feel that our mind is slipping into it. The empathy gap is very common in our day-to-day lives because it is mostly conditioned into our minds as a harmless thing. To begin, the empathy gap is defined as our inability to gauge someone's mental state that is opposite to ours. For example, a person who fell into a ditch is going to have a mental state of anxiety. An onlooker or passerby who does not help but pities the sufferer's condition is unable to gauge their mental state and hence has an empathy gap. Unless the onlooker jumps into the ditch himself, he cannot feel the same level of anxiety or share a similar mental state, which ultimately creates this gap. It is hard to remain vigilant of dissimilar mental state when interacting with people because it is difficult to gauge what someone is really going through. What makes empathy gap powerful is our collective ignorance towards understanding the idea of empathy and separating it from sympathy. This is because most of us are simply conditioned to act like the onlooker to express our pity and sympathy. We adapt this behavior to feel sorry and project ourselves as a kind person to the world. The problem aggravates when this conditioning gets unconsciously applied to our bad habits. It paves the way towards a poor sense of self. Empathy gap is fascinating as it really delves into the misuse of sympathy, our differing mental states, and of course, lack of compassion for self and for others. Watch this full video to dive deep into this topic to understand the fundamentals of self-love and unshackle your mind from the foundations of sympathy. I hope you found this video informative and useful. For more such videos, please like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. See you again with another interesting topic.